Thank you very much, Helen, for that very kind introduction. So I just make this disclaimer that while I am a public servant of the Canadian Department of Health, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily represent the official position of Health Canada or the Government of Canada. And while I am a volunteer serving as chair of the United States Pharmacopeal Convention's 2020 to 2025 Botanical Dietary Supplements and Herbal Medicines Expert Committee, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily represent the official position of USP or the expert committee. Just to give you a brief bit about my background, Helen already mentioned a few things, but I wanted to put a bit of context into this discussion on safety of botanicals in the context of Africa by mentioning that over the last 45 years, I have had the honor and privilege of studying with traditional healers, working with their information on uses of botanicals, foods, technology, and rituals from a number of different parts of the world, including the Pacific coastal region and northern boreal forest region of Canada, the Amazon jungle of eastern Ecuador, and more briefly in diverse regions of Mexico, Morocco, and Togo. These studies were part of my bachelor's degree in botany, my master's in ethnobotany, and my PhD in ethnopharmacology and pharmacognosy. And I also did some postdoctoral research in this area and was a professor for 10 years doing ethnobotanical research before joining Health Canada in 2003. And so even in my role as a regulator at Health Canada, I have been involved a lot with safety assessments of botanicals for including in supplements, which in Canada we call natural health products, where I had the great pleasure of working with Nana Bafioboa, and more recently working in foods, and then on the USP with Helen and Amy. So a lot of good friends in this presentation today, in this seminar. Now, as Helen mentioned, botanical quality standards, such as those in the USPNF, the Dietary Supplements Compendium, and the USP Herbal Medicines Compendium, which are all available online. And these are ones that we're actually working towards developing some digital standards that can be accessed directly online as well, which will greatly facilitate their use internationally. And these are absolutely essential to provide validated methods for making sure that you have the right plant, that it's pure, it's of the appropriate strength. Because if what is on the label is not what is in the bottle, and no more and no less, then you don't have any assurance of either efficacy or of safety. And as we know, hazards can come from a variety of sources. They may be accidental contaminants. And the example I have from my own research here is a plasticizer that came from dirty chloroform in an extract, chloroform methanol extract of parapara leaf, Hymelariodendron brunonianum in the Nyctaginaceae. And this plasticizer has estrogenic effects as well as cytotoxic effects. So it is very toxic, and it is a very common contaminant in dirty solvents. And so this is an issue with botanical extracts that are made with organic solvents. You can also have contaminants that are deliberate, or adulterants that are deliberately added, and sometimes not with any malicious intent. Coumarin has been added for years to vanillin extracts to make it more fragrant and more similar to the natural vanilla, or smell even better. But coumarin does have issues in people who have impaired liver function in terms of its toxicity there. And so this is something that was deliberately added to vanillin extracts. This was actually the topic of my very first scientific publication many years ago. And then more recently, Helen and I published a paper with our colleague Joseph Brinkman on the challenge of switching plants so that you have a substitution. And in this case, it is substituting different forms of cassia for the more what we call the true cinnamon of Sri Lanka. And the fact that these cassia plants actually have quite a bit of coumarin in them. And it's not only a toxicity issue, but a lot of studies have been published on the use of cinnamon to treat or reduce the effects of diabetes. But in most of these clinical trials, they never bothered to determine whether they had true cinnamon or one of the cassia species. And so the applicability of that clinical data is a real issue as well. So you have challenges with both efficacy and with safety in that. And this is significant because, of course, cinnamon is an important crop in various areas of Africa, like in Sao Tome and Principe, and in Madagascar in particular, but in other African countries as well. So that can be a real challenge. Now, while my background is clearly as a scientist, I have had this opportunity to work with many different traditional healers. And so reflecting back on my experience, I've really come to believe that traditional knowledge also involves science. And the traditional healers are examining the same natural phenomena that we are. They simply have a different perspective on it. And so while they're not doctors or scientists in the conventional sense, they have these same attributes of dedication to helping restore and maintain the health of their patients, a desire for lifelong learning, very keen powers of observation, problem solving with diagnosis, considering treatment options, administering that treatment and seeing what happens, whether or not it works. And we know from a lot of studies that have been published in the literature that these investigations of traditional knowledge can lead to very important scientific discoveries. So one I have here is the West African plant ackee, and is well known that unripe ackee is poisonous. And scientific investigations of that well-known toxicity led to the discovery of hypoglycin A in the unripe arils and hypoglycin B in the seeds, both of which can cause profound hypoglycemia, vomiting, and death. So indeed, as David set out in the introduction, these natural products can cause death. Just to give you a more concrete example of what I mean by traditional knowledge of botanical safety having some very interesting implications. During my doctoral field research with the traditional healers of the lowland Quechua people in eastern Ecuador, and here's Dionisio Aguinda and his family. He's one of the traditional healers that I worked with. It was widely known in the area that the trunks of the Wambula tree, Minquartia guianensis in the Olacaceae, were very popularly used for house posts, and people said that termites would not eat these posts. And for me, that immediately popped up a toxicity flag that the insects would not eat it. Now, they also mentioned that it is very widely used in the traditional medicine among this Quechua culture for intestinal parasites. However, one of the traditional healers told me that it is too strong to give to infants directly. So the traditional route of administration is to give the extract to the mother, and the medicine passes through the breast milk with reduced activity to make it a safe treatment for intestinal parasites in the infants. As part of my PhD research, I collected some of this Wambula bark and did the standard pharmacognosy bioassay guided fractionation and isolation. And the main active compound that I discovered in the bark was this very fat-soluble polyacetylene with a calculated octanol water partition coefficient of 3.7, which means that it is very lipophilic. It's still within the range of less than 5, so active orally. But this would be something very interesting to follow up on in terms of its presence in breast milk. It's something that I have been interested in for some time, although I'm by no means an expert. There are ways of modeling whether or not a compound can get into breast milk based on its lipophilicity, its degree of ionization due to the pKa, and whether or not there is diffusion or active transport. There's a variety of factors that determine whether it gets into the breast milk, but it seems a reasonable hypothesis that this would actually pass through to some extent into the breast milk. So a very interesting potential lead for safety from traditional knowledge. Many years ago now, back in 1996, I had the most wonderful opportunity to attend the international seminar on the theme of the development of ethical phytomedicines, organized by my dear friend and colleague who I have known for 40 years now, Misanvi Biasor, at the Université du Bénin in Lomé, Togo. And so he organized this seminar, and then his colleague, Kofi Akpagana, led an amazing field trip on traditional medicine in Togo afterward. And so this seminar brought together Western African and Canadian scientists, physicians, and healers from various traditions, Muslim, Buddhism, and Christian, to learn from each other. The seminar and the subsequent field trip and meetings that we had with traditional healers was truly a mind-expanding experience of great mutual benefit to all who participated. Now, I am not an expert by any means in Africa. Togo and Morocco are the only two countries that I've visited, but just in those two countries, there is an amazing diversity and wealth of resources, from the Mediterranean forests in the north, the Amazon jungle, the Sahara Desert. And I found this fascinating, that you could see the snow-covered mountains, the Atlas Mountains from the desert with the palm trees in the foreground, the oases in the Sahara Desert, and very dry conditions in the southern parts of Morocco there. And then in Togo, where you have this lush coastal forest and fascinating flora here. So that there's really an amazing diversity of resources from a botanical as well as a cultural perspective. And when we look at evaluating the safety of these botanical resources for the potential development of medicines, we have to think about the fact that this has to be done in an ecologically, economically, and people tend to forget this, but I like to emphasize culturally sustainable fashion as well, through local gardening, just a local village garden in Togo here, in situ tending, wildcrafting from the forest regions, and agricultural production. This is a photo from Morocco. And that as this is developed, we need to really focus on the fact that this shouldn't just be for dollars, for export value, but really focused on developing products for the needs of African people themselves through local research and development, such as this herbal processing facility in Lomé, getting things into the local markets in the rural areas where people are really struggling with access to primary health care and health products, as well as into the urban markets, as you see here in Togo. So I'm not going to do a long presentation here. I'm going to try and just set some of the context for my colleagues who are going to do much more technical presentations. But to reiterate some of the points that Helen started with, the use of botanicals for healthcare needs is absolutely increasing globally, and this is going to create significant pressures on the natural resources of Africa. Botanicals are indeed naturally complex due to differences in genetics, growing conditions, processing, and manufacturing factors. And we have developed some very sophisticated methods to address that complexity and really work on trying to identify plants accurately, determine that they are pure and not subject to contamination or adulteration, whether that's chemical or microbiological, make sure that they have the appropriate strength, because we do see exhausted plant materials after they've been extracted and then the mark is being sold. So making sure it has the appropriate strength, and then evaluating safety through some of the very innovative methods that Connie and Amy are going to be talking about in the upcoming talks. But I do want to reiterate, based on my own experience, that remarkable insights are to be found in traditional botanical knowledge, and that this is a very culturally and environmentally relevant knowledge. So it is really valuable when associated with the botanical resources to get those cultural resources as well. And they are not contradictory. People sometimes tend to dismiss traditional knowledge, but in my experience, in many cases, it is complementary to what our scientific instruments and modern methods can reveal. So we need to continue to document, preserve, investigate these traditional herbal medicines, but we also have to make sure that it is culturally sustainable by including that in the education of the young people, so that they are learning, even though they may now be in a school rather than in the traditional cultural setting where this knowledge would have been passed on, but to continue to learn the knowledge of their traditional healers, because it is an important part of their cultural heritage. But also, as we see through scientific investigations of traditional knowledge, that this may indeed provide them with very tangible future benefits. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Asante sana. I am happy to take any questions, whether the moderator wishes it to be done now or later on. But I did try to go through this fairly quickly to leave more time for my colleagues with their more technical presentations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robin. That was a wonderful presentation. And we have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if anybody has a burning question, other than that, we'll leave it to the end. David, do you see any question?
No, but I just wanted to ask, so I'm fascinated with hypoglycine because I think it then also turned up in lychee, right? Which we like to eat, and we should not be eating when we are hungry, apparently. Has that been developed into an anti-diabetic, or is that still something that people are looking at?
I believe that it is part of the investigation into potential anti-diabetics due to the mechanism of action. It's not actually the hypoglycin itself, which is active, but a metabolite from it.
Okay.
But you know, one of the big challenges we often have is that nature, through evolution, has developed very efficient toxins. And the big challenge for us as scientists is to try and make it more selective so that it has the desired activity of perhaps helping to treat diabetes and not the very potent toxic effects that we see from hypoglycin A and B. So to my knowledge, this hasn't been fully developed, but it certainly opens up an interesting perspective through its mechanism of action.
Thank you very much. Colleagues can also just type in their questions and we can come back to them, or comments in the chat box, so we can come back to them at some point. But Helen,
Great.
over back to you.
Yes, in the interest of time, I think we can continue and leave the questions for later. Now, after that wonderful presentation, now I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Constance, we call her Connie Michel. Connie is the Scientific Program Manager at Health and Environmental Science Institute, HESI, a science nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining HESI in 2020, she was a fellow at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency working on chemical prioritization. Connie completed her graduate studies in environmental toxicology in 2008 at the University of California, Riverside, where she investigated flame retardant-induced developmental toxicity in human cells and zebrafish embryos. At HESI, she co-manages the Botanical Safety Consortium, which we'll be talking about. Connie also co-manages other projects related to toxicology and risk assessment. She has authored 13 peer-reviewed papers, has presented at numerous national and international scientific meetings on topics ranging from toxicology, risk assessment, and new approach methodologies. Connie, please take it away.